Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Skillshare, and more on the sponsor a little bit later. Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of Rapid Fire Reading Tips to help you become a better reader. And today, given the results from the community poll that we did, the winner here is actually content versus form, a video on content versus form, and this is basically going to be an introduction into how to read between the lines when you're reading literature and philosophy, and when you're engaging with pieces of writing on the internet, or when you're engaging with some very complicated pieces of writing. This is a general rule of thumb that you can live by, and you can sort of judge different forms of writing using this general rule. And hopefully you can take this tip away with you to apply to all of your readings. So let's start with the question that plagues every English major ever, or every beginner reader ever. So if you're just interested in literature or philosophy or some other kinds of esoteric reading material, at some point you're going to find yourself staring at a page asking yourself, what does it all mean? The trick with better reading is that if you're not equipped to deal with the reading material, if you just kind of like naively assume that you can kind of glide your eyes across the page and somehow make sense of what's on the page, then you are going to set yourself up for confusion and episodes of getting mad at yourself and episodes of banging your head against the wall. Because writing and reading, these are fields that we've completely taken for granted, and the education system really hasn't supplied us with much guidance or proper training in this faculty. And I guess we've never learned to treat different reading material with different frames of reading, and you can't just treat everything with a one-size-fits-all solution. And this is very difficult to do because words all look the same on the page. They're basically a collection of densely packed words in a format of a book with a pretty cover. And sometimes without proper training, it's really hard to tell them apart because they just all look the same. They're all just words. And today we're going to make a clear distinction between two forms of reading. First mode is reading for understanding, and a second mode is reading for aesthetic pleasure. So for the rest of this video, we are going to explain these 2 points in a bit of depth, so hopefully you can walk away from this video knowing which one is which. But before that, I have something really exciting to kind of talk about, which is today's video sponsor, Skillshare. In short, Skillshare is a smorgasbord of different classes that you can take that are specifically specialized more in the creative field. So if you want to learn about graphic design, if you want to learn about UX design, if you want to learn about creative writing, fine arts, Skillshare will have a right class and a right teacher for you, regardless of your skill level, because some of these classes could be at a pro level, and the other classes might be designed for you at a beginner's level. Personally, I used Skillshare a lot during the beginning phases of my business, and Skillshare as a platform really provided me with all those skill sets that I needed to learn, and they really perfected those skills with these targeted courses in UX design, graphic design, and of course, photography and videography. And one course that I'm particularly proud of, because I've created it, is my Back to Basics course on how to bring intelligent reading into your life. I created and curated this course about a year ago, and this is basically like a cheat sheet of my over 200 videos that I've done on my channel. And this course is basically a cheat sheet that's going to give you an express laneway into every concept, or the essential concepts that I've covered on this channel. In the course, we talked about how to select the right books, we talked about how to establish a reading habit, and of course I provided you with 2 entry points, one into literature and one into philosophy, to sort of complete the whole package of guiding you into the basics of bringing more reading into your life. And I think if you enjoy my regular content, you're going to get a lot of value out of this one. And here's another piece of good news for you guys. The first 500 people can get this course for free, because Skillshare is offering you guys a 1-month free trial for Skillshare. So it's not just my course. You can access all the other courses, watercoloring, photography classes, creative writing classes, all for a 1 click in the description down below. And again, thank you Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And now we are going to get back to this distinction between reading for understanding and reading for aesthetic pleasure. So let's start with reading for understanding. As a broad generalization, anytime you spot a text that's kind of dry, that's laden with statistics and arguments and the person trying to sound smarter than they are, it's probably the case that it is a piece of writing that demands your attention to understand it. Broadly speaking, reading for understanding is really all about finding arguments, finding propositions, finding overarching philosophical principles by parsing through the text line by line, by finding out the important information in the text. I've covered this kind of analytical reading in a short video of mine. It's actually quite a popular video, so you can watch it, you know, it's probably going to pop up somewhere on the screen right here. You're essentially trying to get behind the text. You're essentially trying to use texts as indicators for what the text is supposed to mean, because the author is always trying to put forth arguments and justifications and evidence and elaborations to convince you of their viewpoints of the world or their entire system of thinking. And one of the prime examples of reading for understanding is philosophy books. And have you ever wondered why philosophy books are so damn difficult to read? We can proudly crown philosophy as the home of bad writing, because actually the focus for these kinds of reading isn't really about the form of the writing, isn't really about writing beautiful prose so you get lost in a sea of great stories and visions and affects, but it's really about walking you through the hoops so that you would eventually understand where this thinker's coming from. And some of these frames of thinking could get really complicated real fast. For example, Immanuel Kant's famous 3 critiques, critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, and critique of judgment, you know, they're really philosophically rigorous works, but God, are they awful to read on a daily basis. And we can say the same for Theodore Adorno, which is the critical theorist, and we can say the same for Hegel, we can say the same for Jameson. So there are many of these examples where they've got some good thinking going on up in their heads, but God, their writing is just sometimes really tedious to get through. In summary, reading for understanding isn't necessarily about putting your attention on the form of the writing. That's why sometimes the form could be quite bad and difficult to read. The point isn't really to enjoy these texts, but the point is for you to jump through all these mental hoops to reach where the philosopher is reaching. You're after that sudden vision of enlightenment, after parsing through some tedious writing, after weaving through some complicated arguments, and after tracing the author's line of thinking. And finally, the fog parts, and man, you understand this piece of writing, or you understand this philosopher, or you understand that sociologist, or whatever else. And just as a bit of a reversal here, there are cases in philosophy where the authors are really good writers, and Byung-Chul Han is a very good point. His books are beautifully written, yet also philosophically rigorous. So in a sense, you're getting the pleasure of reading and philosophical understanding out of the same book, but man, doing this kind of stuff is really hard because it's really hard to carry complicated thinking into readable language, and this is a challenge every thinker needs to face. And that leads us to the second mode of reading, which is reading for aesthetic pleasure. You can usually tell where someone's reading level's at once you show them a passage from a piece of literary work. Are they irritated at the prose of the work? Do they not see the point of describing everything in a flowery language? Do they think the author's being purposefully opaque with their writing? And most importantly, do these people ask you to explain what the passage means? If a person enters literature from this frame of view of like, I don't see the point in all this language, I don't see the point of this passage, or I don't see the point of creating the kind of language to communicate the story, then that basically tells you that they're confusing reading for understanding with reading for aesthetic pleasure. Now, reading for aesthetic pleasure is not reading for understanding, because aesthetic pleasure stems from a place where you have to give up that need to explicate everything. You're kind of in it to get lost in a moment. You're in it to seek out the way the words make you feel. You're there to appreciate this passage or this paragraph from a moment-to-moment basis, and you're trying to gain some sort of sensory joy out of it, some sort of emotional joy out of it. And honestly, if reading literature is all about asking what it means, then all novels will be written in lists, not paragraphs. This knee-jerk reaction for us to get to the bottom of a piece of literature without realizing that, hey, actually everything's already on the surface, you're supposed to derive the point of this literature from the surface of this text, is in a sense barricading us from accessing what literature's actually for. It's supposed to be there as an aesthetic object. It's there for us to appreciate the beauty of the words. One of the exemplars of reading for aesthetic pleasure is poetry. And our friend Byung-Chul Han here, who I just referenced a few minutes ago, has some pretty important things to say about poetry. Quote, "A poem, a form made of signifiers, linguistic signs, is a thing because it cannot be dissolved into meanings. Like I explained in the last video, the form exists in its own right. It carries its own weight, and there's really no point for us to remove the form and somehow get to a deeper meaning of the thing. And a point of reading these forms that stand on their own is to gain as much pleasure as possible from words beyond their meaning. So in summary, poetry and literature, unlike philosophy, gain their profundity from ambiguity. The joy doesn't stem from sudden visions of enlightenment like philosophy, but they stem from lingering with the words. They stem from asking different questions. They stem from getting kind of confused by the whole story of certain phrasing in a novel, or they stem from this adventure in hunting down different ways of portraying the world and different ways of viewing the world and different ways of feeling the world. So it's a very magical experience. And perhaps the most important gift literature and poetry could give us is to show us different shades of the world that were previously inaccessible to us. And that's how reading these kinds of books builds empathy within us. In the final analysis, reading for understanding and reading for aesthetic pleasure, these are two very different things that you shouldn't mix up, and if you mix them up, you're signing yourself up for some major episodes of headache. Just as a bit of a side note, there are certain books that sort of contain both forms of reading. So for example, you can have a novel that employs some pretty heavy erudition, that employs a lot of sort of like explanation or expository writing that drives you insane. And vice versa, there could be a book that's trying to teach you a concept through a beautiful story. And the hallmark of being a really strong reader is being able to tell which is which, even within the same paragraph. You as a reader, this is one of the skills that you really have to practice, which is to read between the lines and to tell which is which, because without this key distinction here, a text gets confusing real fast. And just as a bit of a practical takeaway at the end of this video, practice makes perfect, so don't be afraid to dip your toes into a book, and don't be afraid if you can't quite tell reading from understanding from reading for aesthetic pleasure just yet. Once you're exposed to enough texts, and once you get into some episodes of confusion, once you sort that confusion out, one day you will be able to develop that sensitivity toward words. One day you will be able to read through a book like an X-ray, so you can identify clearly this book is about this book is trying to educate me, or this book is supposed to give me some aesthetic pleasure. So all in all, everything's fine. You just have to read a little more to get to this point. Nevertheless, that's all I want to cover in today's video. Hope you guys have gained some value out of it, and leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Are you also struggling to tell form apart from content? Are you also struggling with books related to understanding and related to gaining aesthetic pleasure? So let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Anyway, thank you for watching yet another episode of Rapid Fire Reading Tips to help you become a better reader. And Robin Waldun here. I will see you in the next video. For now, take care, happy reading, and goodbye.